What's up guys, welcome to our tutorial for March of 2022. In this one, we're going to be talking about characters in environments. I'm always telling people to try drawing their backgrounds, not run from their responsibilities. Well, today I'm going to show you guys how you can also stop running from your responsibilities and draw some backgrounds. As always, we're going to start off with some main themes and concepts that I want you guys to keep in mind for this tutorial, and then we're going to get into the demonstrations. And right off the bat guys, I also want to mention that if you're trying to draw complex, difficult environments, you're gonna have to know your perspective. I've made a pretty basic intro to perspective video on YouTube in the past. It's pretty old, but it kind of gets all the basic points across. So you can check that out. I'm gonna link it down below. But with that being said, let's talk about characters and backgrounds and environments. So on the screen here, you can see a bunch of examples of my previous work and the reference photos that were used to actually create them. And what you're gonna notice is that the character or the environment is not gonna be exactly 100% one for one from the reference to the painting. When I'm drawing my characters in their environments, even if I'm referencing only one single image, I still like to make some changes to make the final result my own. Now here are two very important concepts that I like to keep in mind when I'm drawing characters in an environment. Point number one is consistency, and this is referring to the consistency in the lighting on the character. Now, if we take a look at the first painting here, you can see that the lighting, the sunlight on the character is coming from the top left, and the sunlight hitting the cloud is also coming from the same direction. Simple things like that. You can also see it in the second piece where there is a lighter background casting a bit of a silhouette for the character. And on the very edge of the silhouette, you can see there's some red lighting alluding to the fact that the lighting in the environment is interacting with the lighting on the character. You want that consistency. And same thing with the final piece here. You can see this character, much of her upper torso is in shadow, whereas her lower torso is being lit up by the car's headlights, which matches the lighting in the environment where the car's headlights would shine lower and the upper body of the character would be silhouetted by this bright light in the back. I think one of the most common mistakes that a lot of us make is when we're drawing characters in a background, we tend to think of the character and the background as separate entities, when really we should be thinking of them almost as one, because the lighting in the environment is going to interact with the lighting on the character and vice versa. So that's point number one. We want to stay consistent with the lighting and color on our character as well as the lighting and color in our environment. You can separate them on different layers, but remember that they're one united entity. Now let's go on to point number two, which is clarity. And when I say clarity, what I'm referring to is how readable is your character. You guys can see on the screen here, if you take a look at the artwork versus the reference, if you squint a little bit and take a step back, you're gonna realize that the silhouette of these characters in the drawings are much more pronounced than the silhouettes of the characters in the reference photos. And that's not by chance, that's done on purpose to make the drawing overall more readable. Now, because clarity is actually a lot more demonstratable, I'm going to show you guys a couple of examples of just how I think of this concept and how I work it into my paintings. Now, here we have on the screen a beautiful reference photo, but it's not the best because we can't really make out the silhouette of this character. She's kind of blending into the background because there is a dark patch right here and her clothes also happen to be of a darker color. But what we're going to do is we're going to change that. So I'm just taking my round brush with pressure opacity. I'm going to select one of the lighter colors here, and I'm going to apply a bit of a fog behind the character. And what I'm actually trying to do is I'm trying to define the silhouette of this character. I'm trying to provide more clarity and more readability. Now, because this character is wearing a darker piece of clothing, if I make the background lighter, what that means is there's going to be more contrast in terms of the values between the background and the foreground, which is our character. And also notice how with this fog, I'm not going all the way up to the tip of the hat because this hat is actually of a much lighter value. So we can actually keep the darker value on top of the hat. We can kind of keep that there because that provides the best contrast and clarity. So there is a very quick edit to the original to create a little bit more clarity. And one way to check how readable your composition is to zoom out and look at it when it's very small, like a little thumbnail. And here we can see that the character in the edited composition jumps out of the background a lot more effectively. And we can actually do a very similar thing here with this composition. So if you were taking this reference and you were trying to paint it, the one thing that I would change about this is the contrast between the top of her hair and the background here. You can see that there's a darker value in the background and also a darker value on the hair. So they kind of almost merge into each other, and the silhouette of her head doesn't necessarily stand out as much as I would like to. So in this case, we would take a lighter color and maybe just bring down the light in the back. And now when we take a step back from this reference image, you can see that the back of her head, its silhouette is reading much more clearly than in the original. And that concept right there is what you see happening in all three of these compositions. Now, I know there are a lot of you guys out there who are trying to get into art schools in the future or trying to get into an art related career. These concepts might not be super apparent to somebody who is just scrolling on Instagram and comes across your painting. But if you're ever submitting a character / environment drawing to a portfolio, let's say for an employer or a school, in the eyes of a professional artist or somebody who's much more experienced, they're immediately going to be able to tell whether or not you have a good grasp on these concepts. So especially for those of you guys who are serious about art, knowing these basic concepts of clarity and consistency is going to separate your work from the work of many other people. Anyways, or you could just be drawing for fun. I'm not trying to scare you guys, I promise. Anyway, so there's two simple but extremely powerful concepts that I want you guys to know before we start doing the demonstrations, and now you're going to be able to see them in action. Backgrounds can easily be one of the most confusing things to do when you're used to drawing characters on their own. The thing with backgrounds is there's no consistency like you would find in a portrait where everybody has a skull, everybody has eyebrows, eyes, nose, mouth, and a chin. With drawing characters and stuff, there's a bit of a formula we can follow. So it doesn't matter how different your character looks, there's always a bit of a structure. Now, when it comes to backgrounds, it's as though every single one is completely different. The only consistency when it comes to backgrounds is the perspective grid. What I'm saying is, if you're having difficulty with backgrounds, try to start with the simple ones. One step at a time. Don't go too complicated too fast, because that's just gonna overwhelm you and you're not going to be happy with the results, and you're going to just start quitting doing backgrounds altogether, and that's not what I want. Okay, so start small, start simple. It's really one of those things that's going to get easier with studies and with practice. But with that being said, I want to give you guys a quick demo in the way I think about backgrounds, the way I approach them, and the way that I think about fitting my characters into an environment. Hopefully this can shed some light on how you guys can also integrate your characters into backgrounds and start drawing reference images with backgrounds and characters and all that good stuff. So we're gonna start simple with some references. When I'm drawing backgrounds, I always have a reference. Now let's get into this thing. So I've turned the subject for the reference into my OC, and we're gonna try to frame the background around her. When I start a piece like this, I always start to work from the back, and I always look for the big shapes, right? So don't worry at all about the leaves, the details on the bamboos. We don't need any of that right now at the beginning. We just want to find the big blocks of color. So there's green right here. There might be a little bit of variation. There's a beautiful green right there. And we're going to get that brighter color in the top left corner, as you can see in the reference image. That's the main thing. That's the biggest thing I want to get down. Now I'm going to move down into the slightly darker region closer to the ground, and then you're going to see a warmer tone for the color of the ground itself, like that. And we can change the colors as we go, but if you're drawing a background like this, do not worry about the small details, because otherwise you're going to get overwhelmed very quickly, very easily. So now we're going to draw these darker shapes for the bamboo that you see in the background. And remember not to detail it, but isolate them into individual shapes. There we go. I'm gonna bring a vibrant color into this light section here. Okay, there we go. And now we're gonna move to the foreground, where you see this big piece of bamboo right here in the front, and this adds a lot of depth to the composition. And now we can also start to add in some of the leaves that we see on this side also in the foreground. Kind of just very roughly erasing back into it to create that illusion of detail there, and we're not actually putting down any detail just yet. So there we go, there's our background and our foreground, and I like to do this before we start working on the character so that I can get the sense of the atmosphere and the environment first, and doing it this way usually helps me maintain the consistency on the lighting on the character. So now I'm going to start a separate layer. I'm going to get the silhouette of the character. I'm going to fill it just like that with a solid color that I think represents her. There we go. Now she's covering up part of the background, and I can get a better sense of how this overall composition is going to look. This is where I usually like to start adding in a little bit more detail. So you can see the leaves there covering a bit of the bright spot in the back. We're going to try to define some of these shapes in the background a little bit more, add a little bit more complexity here. And just for the sake of time, I'm not going to fully render out every single background, but we're just going to do a decent enough color sketch for it so that you guys can get a sense of my process, because I don't want this video to end up being 7 hours long. So you can see these bright spots in the back shining through the bamboo. I notice there's a bit of a blur in the background, like that bokeh effect. Don't worry guys, I will also show you how to do that later on when we finish detailing the back. There we go. So I'm trying to keep my colors to a minimum. I don't want to jump around too much on the color scale because then things might start looking muddy. So there's a bit of shadow for the bush in the back. And then we can start to kind of define the shapes of these leaves against the shadow. Remember guys, to keep it very loose. Don't worry too much about fine details in the back. Usually when you're drawing a background with a character, the background is a secondary point of interest and it is not the primary point of interest. And don't be too much of a perfectionist of how the background details actually look. And speaking of that, I'm going to lighten up the silhouette around the character a little bit of stylization in the back to make this composition more readable from afar when you're zoomed out. And one thing that I always like to keep on hand is the eyedropper tool so that I can use the colors that I've already put down and reapply it into areas that need to be adjusted so that I'm not picking a new color every time, because if you're doing that, your background could very, very easily start looking chaotic and muddy. So after this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in the even darker shadows, the even finer details, and I'm going to follow the composition I've laid down previously. Remember, we are working from the big picture down to the small details. You never go the other way around. Big picture to small detail, not the other way around. So I'm going to select a darker color, and I'm seeing a bit more shadow in these bushes. And again, guys, I'm just using a simple round brush here, so anybody can do this. The brush is not an excuse. We're going to create some simple leafy textures. One really good thing about this background is you don't have to polish it up fully because it is slightly blurred, and we're going to add that effect to it later on. So now we're just adding in some darker shadows, refining the details a little bit, right? Finding these little slivers of light in between the bamboo. And at this stage, we can actually afford to use a little bit more variation in our colors. So I see a bit of ambient lighting on the leaves here from the blue sky, I'm assuming. And from that, we're gonna get a much more kind of turquoise-ish color shining onto the top surface of the leaves. Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect, right? We're not going for perfect details. We're not going for perfection. What I find most important in backgrounds is number one, the composition and the perspective. And number two is the colors. If you find the right colors for all these specific spots, your background is going to be very convincing regardless of your brushwork. And if you're ever looking at a picture like this and you find yourself having difficulty knowing which colors to pick, just take your eyedropper tool, go over the image and look at the range of colors, right? Look at where it is on the hue slider, look at how saturated or desaturated that color is. You know, if you really just don't understand what color something is, use your eyedropper tool and look at where it sits on the hue scale and try to remember that. But one thing to avoid is doing this and then painting directly into your painting with that color, because we want to train your brain to learn to find that color on its own. Using the eyedropper is more like, you know, when you're stuck on a question and you want a bit of a hint, you know, something to help you out. So I'm just adding in some final small details in the back here, a little bit of definition for the leaves. And there we go. I think the background here is starting to look pretty good. I'm just gonna add a bit more shadow to the ground, right? Maybe a little bit more texture here as well. Make it look like there's fallen leaves on the ground, there's dirt, all kinds of detail. And I'm doing all of this with a basic round brush because since we're gonna be blurring the background, you don't really need to worry too much about the textures. A little bit of shadow there, darkness. And there we go, there's a pretty convincing looking background here. And I've done all this before I even started working on the character. So usually at this stage, this is when I like to jump into the character. When the background is about, 80% ready to go, this is when I like to start defining the character a little bit more. Because like I said before with the concept of consistency, you wanna make sure that the lighting hitting your character makes sense for the background and the environment that the character is in. One thing that I actually want to point out to you guys just before we start the rendering is if you look at the colors on this character, look at how it stays within the greenish, turquoise-ish kind of range, just like the colors in the background, because the lighting in the environment is interacting with the colors on the character. If you were to take this character and you were to give her a nice warm oranges, kind of like almost sunset looking lighting, it wouldn't make sense in this environment unless, of course, you also had a warm orange lighting in the rest of the environment. And in this case, we don't. So we're going to take a lot of cues from the colors that we've used in the background. And that's going to be our color for the hair. It's going to kind of reflect what's around her. And right away, when we add in this dark color, we can see actually how effective our background rendering was in terms of bringing out the contrast between the background and the foreground. And in this case, I feel like we need a little bit more. So I'm gonna add back in a lighter color to the area just behind her head. Right there and right there. Just to give it a little bit more contrast. Now, since Lynn is my character, I'm not going to be coloring her exactly one for one as you see in the reference because she has her own costume, her own outfit, and she's gonna look a little bit different from the reference image. But as you can see here, what we are gonna do is we are going to apply the same light and shadow as you see in the reference photo. So light is coming from the left and the shadow is gonna be on the right. We're also getting a bit of blue ambient lighting on the backside, so there's that right there. And if you look at the reference, you can see that it's very bright towards the front side of the character. So we're gonna get that nice bright lighting, kind of a cool bluish light, and we're going to apply that onto her clothing. As well as onto her face. So there we go. There we go. I'm keeping it very simple, very rough right now. And we're gonna add a bit of blush, some local color right there. A bit of red on the ears. I'm gonna use the eyedropper to select the darkest color on our character and use that for parts of her costume that are also dark. Remember that if you're trying to use a color And there's something similar to it on the canvas already. Just use your eyedropper tool and select that color. It actually helps you get more consistency with your drawings. And of course, her clothing is going to be red, so we're going to have to change this to red. And because the lighting is hitting the front side, this side will be in shadow, whereas the front will be in light. We can add in some ambient lighting to the back, onto the hair. All right, so let's add in some final touches. I think the character here actually looks quite good. And this piece here would be one that I would be confident to take to the finish line. Add in a little bit more detail, especially for the shadows on the clothing. Once again, guys, not gonna fully render this piece because I want to keep this video under 7 hours, but you should still be able to get a very good idea of my workflow by looking at these relatively quick drawings. So there we go. There's a bit of definition on the character, and let's add in a bit more shadow. Add in the shadow underneath the jaw right there, a little bit in the ear, a little bit of loose hairs here and there. Beautiful. Usually at this stage, you know, I feel pretty good about the way the character looks. I feel pretty good about the way the background looks. If I were to fully render this piece out, I would be adding in some of the very small, very refined little details in the foliage and things like that. You know, it really is a process of working on top of the foundations that you've laid down each and every step of the way. You never want to start off with these small details because that's how you get overwhelmed. Instead, we lay down the big foundations so that we have a structure that we can build on top of as we draw these backgrounds and environments. So there we go, the background is ready to go. Now what we're going to do is we're going to come to the foreground and add in a little bit more definition. I'm going to just darken these leaves in the foreground like that, darken this bamboo here, a little bit of a ring texture like that right there. And actually, you know what, guys, looking at this piece right now, I feel like there's not enough contrast between the front of the character's face and the background there. So I'm going to actually darken this patch here just like that to create a little bit more clarity, a little bit more readability. So if I open this thumbnail, you can see the outline of the face becomes visible now, whereas before it would kind of merge into the back, and that's not what we want. So there we go. Now for the fun part. If we're trying to finalize this piece, the background has a bit of a bokeh effect. It's blurred, and you can do this on Procreate as well. It's the exact same name. We're gonna go into Filter, Blur Gallery on Photoshop, and we're gonna select Field Blur. So as you toggle the strength of this blur, you can see the background becomes more out of focus. Here it's more in focus, and here's more out of focus. Depends on the effect that you want to go for. Usually I like to do just a tiny bit, hit the return button, and there we go. There's a change to the background. There's a bit of a blur, and we can actually do the same thing for the foreground. So we can go into Filter, Blur Gallery, Field Blur, and we can change how in focus the foreground looks. So we're gonna just do a tiny bit of that. And there we go. We've created some nice depth in the foreground and the background. So that's pretty good for our first piece. Now let's go on to our second demonstration. Look how cute this reference image is, guys. The first one was a lot of organic shapes, a lot of foliage, whereas this one has a lot of rigid structures and man-made objects. So if you guys are drawing backgrounds similar to this, you're gonna be using tools that are slightly different, which I'm gonna show you in this process here. The first part's gonna be very similar to what we've done before. We're gonna select the big colors in the background, the very largest blocks of colors, we're gonna apply them, and then later on we worry about the details. So you know, stuff like the texture on the wood, stuff like the texture on the ground, we're not gonna worry about that at all. Hey guys, remember, simple, no stress. Again, if you have trouble finding the correct colors, use your eyedropper tool to get a hint of where it should be on the hue slider, but don't actually use the color you select, it's just a hint. So I'm gonna have blue on one layer, which is the sky. And for skies, very simple, take an airbrush, get a darker color at the top, and it gets lighter towards the horizon line. That looks pretty good. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna use the polygonal lasso tool, and we're gonna draw a straight line across, and this marks the horizon line where the ocean meets the sky, as you can see in the reference photo. Gonna start a new layer, and we're just gonna get this color in there for the ocean in the background. And on this layer, that's where we're gonna have some small details that you can see in the back. Right there, we can add a bit of color to it. For things that are this far away, they're usually not very detailed at all. So you can get away with basically putting down simple color blocks without any pressure opacity, without any refinement. And usually if you get the right colors, they will make sense. There we go, a simple background. Now I'm also realizing there are clouds in the back that I didn't see before. So let's put that in real quick. And it kind of blends it back into the sky at the bottom. So just gonna blend that back in. There we go, beautiful. And add a bit more detail here actually. There we go. So guys, if you've been following along, now we have the background pretty much defined. Now we're gonna move forward into the foreground and closer to the character. Now what we're gonna do here is we're gonna take the polygonal lasso tool to select the silhouette of this fence in the back. Because this is a man-made structure, it's got a lot of rigidity to it. You know, it's not necessarily a free-flowing shape like the leaves that we saw in the previous one. So this is where the polygonal lasso tool really comes in handy. And now we're gonna select a color that we think represents the fence pretty well. I think that's a bit too light, so we're gonna move it down. That's a bit too dark, I'm gonna move it up. It's a lot of playing around, you gotta figure it out. It's a bit too saturated, so I'm gonna desaturate it, and I think that is something I can work with. Gonna just alpha lock that fence so that I can't paint outside of it. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my round brush and glaze a shadow over it. Just like that. And now we can get a sense of the lighting in this environment. And we're gonna continue to move forward. Once again, using the polygonal lasso tool, we're gonna select the entire ground that our character is sitting on and try to find a color that best represents this area. So I think probably something like that. That's not really bright enough, so we're gonna just move it, experiment. I think that looks pretty good. Again, guys, if you have trouble with this, use your eyedropper tool and see what color is actually there. So that's actually quite similar to the color that I've selected. So I'm pretty happy with that. And now for the exciting part. Now we're gonna get the silhouette of this character. Just fill it with a base color right there. Clean it up a little bit. Perfect. Now we can start applying the colors onto the character. A very dark kind of brown for the hair. Just like that. And a dark colored t-shirt. Just like that. And of course, light colored pants. But you don't necessarily have to follow the reference one for one. You know, you can make the pants dark colored if you want. You can make the cat black if you want. It just it's completely up to you. Just whatever you're comfortable with. And a little bit of color on the shoe right there. Now we can move on to the little cat. There we go. Nice, bright, yellowish color because the cat is in sunlight. And then at this point, once you feel pretty confident with the colors that you've applied onto the character, the base colors, now you can start applying the lighting based on also what you see in the environment. So because we can tell that this is a very sunny environment, we can also infer that the sunlight is going to be very strong on the character. So even if you were drawing the character in a different position, you kind of know what the lighting is going to look like on her. I'm gonna just add in the highlights from the sunlight. Highlights on the hair. on the back of the t-shirt, and of course on her pants. As well as the shadow on our little friend here. There we go. Shadow. And then we can add a little bit more shadow underneath our character. For cases like this where there's a lot of ambient occlusion, you can see where the character kind of meets the environment right here. This is an area where the light is not going to be able to reach, so it's going to get very dark. And then right below our character, we can add a cast shadow from her. Perfect. And now we can add in the shadow for her skin. There. And also on her face. Maybe give her a bit of bounce light on the front of her face, just like that. And you know, at this stage, you can start polishing out the details a little bit. You know, you can start adding in a little bit more variation in the colors, but you guys get the idea for the process here. Now we're gonna go back into the background and add in some textures, some small details, just like that. Some wood grain on the fence in the back, building on top of what we've already put down. And of course, we can also start adding textures to the foreground. And there we go. This piece could obviously benefit from a little bit more refinement, but for the sake of time, we're just going to keep it very rough and very quick. Now, going back to the concept of clarity, there's something that I think could be better about the composition of this piece, and that is this area of the character's face where it kind of meets the fence in the background. For the sake of a readable and clear silhouette, for the sake of clarity, I think it would be more beneficial if we move this fence down below her face. Reason being, with her face in shadow, you can get a more full and readable silhouette of her entire head without the fence kind of breaking that up. And of course, I'm gonna have to erase the sketch in the back for the fence. And I forgot to add the subsurface scattering on the ear there. That's gonna really make this piece pop. There we go. Much better. So now we have our character comfortably situated in this environment where nothing really looks out of place. Remember, keeping in mind the consistency in the lighting on the character and the environment, as well as being aware of the clarity of your composition. So here's our third example, a bit of a combination between more organic and a little bit more rigid shapes like you see on the front and some of the trees in the back. This background is blurred, so we can afford to be a little bit looser with it, but we're gonna kind of follow the same process and keep the same things in mind. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna look for the biggest shapes, which is these patches in the back. And you're also gonna see the horizon line right there in the distance. So we're gonna just mark that down with a separate block of colors. Now you can do it like this, or you can use a polygonal lasso tool, select the area, and just paint a perfectly straight line. Either method is perfectly okay. Since the sky is very overexposed, we can get a really bright color in here. Kind of accentuate that. There we go. Now I'm gonna come down to the ground. And this is where we see a little bit more vegetation. So this shape right here and this shape right here. Remember to avoid details. So once again, taking that bright color, coming in here because that's the reflection on the water. So here's a pretty good look at the overall composition, and we can start to go in with a little bit more nuance in terms of our rendering. We can start adding in some more shadows to the foliage in the background. Bit of a lighter blue color for the things in the distance, because when you look at things that are really far away in the atmosphere, they tend to have a blue tint. That's because of the atmosphere, you know, washing out the colors that are able to reach our eyes, and we just perceive them as a kind of a light blue color for things that are really, really far away. And again, like we've done before, you know, adding progressively smaller details. Get a bit more vibrant color on the side here, just like that. A little bit more here as well. And we can get a bit more of a vibrant brownish color towards the side, a little bit more yellow here. Just following the colors that you see in the original reference. That looks really good. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start adding in some of these smaller shapes, like the trees here. I don't really want them to be perfectly uniform, so I'm actually going to add a little bit of variation here to these trees. We can start to progressively add in some smaller and smaller shapes here just to kind of define the silhouette of these trees. Now we're also going to see another tree in the background here. Again, because it is blurred, we can afford to be a little bit looser with it. Kind of just very loosely defining the shape, the silhouette of this tree right here in the background. When it comes to backgrounds, remember to not pursue perfection. Just kind of go with the flow, keep it moving. There we go, beautiful. Let the colors speak for themselves. So we're going to get a bit more vibrant green in here. And also it always helps to remember that things in the distance will always be less detailed than things that are closer to us. That's just the way our eyes work. It's the way cameras work. A little bit of detail in the background, which I think looks pretty good, and we can start to add even more shadows to the foreground. So even more variation here. This whole process, we're finding the big shapes, we're defining the large components in this composition, and then based on those components, we can find the smaller details without just absolutely being overwhelmed by just how much complexity there is, because backgrounds are very, very complex. So I think that looks great. And you know, I like to work from the back to the front. So now we can move forward a little bit. We can start adding in these reflections on the water, or that might be dirt, but you know, it's okay. That looks good to me. And we can also add this reflection here, which mirrors this big shape right here in the back. So it's going to be this right here, the reflection. The trees are also going to be reflected in the water. Just going to roughly outline this. Doesn't have to be perfect. And now that I'm getting a look at it from further away, I think I need to go back in and add a bit more saturation to the trees in the very back. There we go. And there we go, there's the backdrop for our character. Now we're gonna move forward. So we can use the polygonal lasso tool and select this big tree trunk right here. We're gonna find a grayish kind of brown color, fill it in. That looks pretty similar to what's there in the reference photo. Again, if you guys are stuck and you can't pick the right color, just use the eyedropper tool and give yourself a hint, but don't use that color directly, because that way you're not learning. And we wanna learn, our goal is to learn. Because this is a cylindrical shape, I'm gonna take an airbrush and apply the light on top and the shadow on the bottom. Just add in a bit more variation in the shading, a bit more nuance, bit of texture. So now you can see that we have a very good sense of what this environment is going to look like, and we can kind of envision how the lighting is going to interact with our character. So I'm going to select her entire silhouette and pick a color. And we're going to just come back in here and clean up the silhouette a little bit. Looks good to me. So now we can start to add in the colors for the character. And if you are putting your own character in here and you're not really sure what colors should be on the character, a really good way to kind of determine that is to look at the colors on the character in the reference image. Let's say your character is wearing white. Well, you have a point of reference right here. This is what white should look like under these lighting circumstances. Or what about the skin of your character? Well, you have a point of reference right here. This is what the skin should look like under these lighting circumstances. You want to be resourceful, guys. Cheat. So we're going to apply this dark color for the hair. Dark color for the costume on the sleeves, and a darker color for the legs. And a red color for the body. And I'm also referring to the red that you see in the reference image. It's very overcast, so colors are not going to really pop in this kind of setting. And we have to keep that in mind, because if you start adding like super bright colors to the tips of the shoulders, to the red on the body, you can see now it starts to look like there's sunlight, and the environment doesn't necessarily match that. If you want to do this, you're going to have to change the environment along with it. You're going to have to bring some very bright colors onto the tree trunk. You're going to have to apply some dark, sharp shadows underneath the character. You're gonna have to make it look like sunlight. You're gonna have to change the entire scene. And that's what I mean when I say don't think of the character and the background as separate entities, because they interact with each other very, very closely. Let's get a brighter color here on the skin for the ambient lighting. There we go. And some blue ambient lighting on this very overcast day. Beautiful. Now to make our character sit in the environment, let's add a shadow. Some ambient occlusion here beneath the legs. And once you're comfortable with this, you can go back into the background and start adding in some more details. You know, for example, the tree trunk here, you can really bring out the texture of the wood. Get some nice rendering going on here. And we can now go back into the background and add even more definition, because we are pretty confident with how this piece looks. So there we go, very quick, very simple render process. And what we're gonna do now is, because you see that bokeh effect in the background, we're gonna go to filter, we're gonna go to blur gallery and select field blur, and we're just gonna make that look a little bit more out of focus. There we go. We're gonna do the exact same thing to the trees in the background. Field blur, and there we go. You see now there's a lot more depth between, you know, our character and what's in the background. You could blur it even more if you want to. And now it really reads as a very strong kind of separation between the character and the background. Now, one thing that I've noticed here, going back to the idea of clarity, I'm gonna just bring this white, bright, overexposed color all the way down here to the back of the character's head. And with this adjustment, you can see that the character's head now pokes out of that darker patch of color and creates a lot more contrast between our character and the backdrop. So look at the thumbnail here, for example. If we make this change, you can see that the character's head, the silhouette, looks a lot clearer. Whereas if we don't make this change, the contrast is not as apparent. So small things like this, when you're looking at the character, you know, the focal point of the entire composition, you really want them to stand out. And if you're ever putting your work into a portfolio for a job or for school, you want to demonstrate that you understand these simple properties of value and contrast. So there we go, there's our third demonstration. Now we're gonna do something a little bit more fun. Now I'm using a photograph to save a little bit of time, but you can also try to paint this scene and then do this afterwards. But we're gonna start a new layer and we're gonna try to put a character into this environment. And this will really drive home the idea of the importance of keeping the lighting and the colors consistent, and also contrast. Now I see a very bright section here, so I think I want my character, at least the character's head, to poke into this section so that I can lighten this background and create even more contrast between the character and the back. So that's what I'm gonna go for. Now, how do I know what the character should look like in this environment? Well, you have to take hints from the things around the character in that environment. So I'm gonna look at the shadow color on the trees here, because the light is coming from the top right and it's kind of coming from this direction. Our character, who is gonna be facing us, for the most part, they will be in shadow. Let's get a silhouette for our character here. We're gonna draw that samurai girl from that one painting of mine. You guys probably know which one I'm talking about. That's the silhouette for the character, and behind her, I wanna add a bit of a bright rim. You can see kind of just following the shapes of the trees. You want to make it still blend into the environment, but just enough so that there's a bit more contrast between the back and the front. Now, immediately once you've done this, look at how strong the contrast is between the background and our character. That's exactly what we're looking for. So now we can start to add in some smaller touches for, the skin on the character's face. And because the face is going to be in shadow, I'm going to have to keep it relatively dark. And there's going to be a bit of a white color on the character, so it's going to take on some of the bluish colors of the ambient lighting. And it's also going to be in shadow. So there we go. There's the white color on our character. And of course, we can't forget about the lighting. So look at how this light shines onto these trees on the ground. You can even trace the direction of the light and how it's going to hit the character. So it's going to come from that direction and reach the left side shoulder of the character. Now, because this is sunlight, we can be a little bit more generous with the amount of contrast that we give it. There we go. Get the shapes of the fold in the fabric there. A little bit maybe on the dress as well. And I think that looks pretty good to me. And I think in this situation, there would be a little bit of ambient lighting coming from the sky. So just a slightly lighter bluish color on the other side, just like that. Again, working from big to small. Once you feel really confident with the way these blocks of colors look, you can start to go in and have some fun, add in some small details. And here you see me just refining the silhouette a little bit, adding in some final touches. So if you have trouble thinking of the environment and the character as one single entity, this exercise here is really good to help you wrap your brain around that. And it's also just a lot of fun to test out your skills like this. And that's pretty much it. Now I'm going to give you guys some homework that you can do to actually practice. What I'm going to do is I'm going to attach a folder of reference images that I find that I think work really well for this month's concept. And I want you to try to follow the steps and the themes that I've outlined in this video to try to recreate those reference images. You can also try to take that reference and put your own character into that image. That's something that I like to do a lot. I think, it makes the drawing experience a lot more personal, a lot more fun, and it makes it feel less like a, boring study. So that's number one. Another assignment you could do is take some photographs like this one that you see right here and try to put your own character into that environment. This here forces you to think about how the character and the environment interact with one another. And that's point number one, that's consistency. And this also makes you look for points of clarity. You gotta think about how you can make this character sit in this environment in the most readable way possible, so that when you zoom all the way out, you can still see that there is a character there and they don't just merge into the background. This is a very fundamental thing when it comes to painting characters in environments. That's work for you guys, okay? Put it in the Discord and show me what you guys come up with, because every single time we make a tutorial and you guys start working on it, I am super proud of the results that I see. So good job, you guys. Give yourselves a pat on the back, and let me see what you guys can come up with this one. I think this is gonna be really fun. With that being said, I hope you guys were able to learn something new. I hope environments and backgrounds behind your characters have become a little bit less intimidating for you guys. Maybe you don't have to avoid it in the future. Anyways, thank you guys once again for all your support, for allowing me to do everything that I do, and to allow me to share my knowledge with you guys. It means a lot to me, and I appreciate you guys for that. With that being said though, I'll see you guys on our next tutorial.